Milan ou Tripoli, Vilnius ou Benghazi, Paris, Moscou, on fait le bunga, bunga. Bangkok ou Bogota, Le Caire ou Jakarta, Gustavia, on fait le bunga, bunga. Stockholm ou Monaco, ou Montevideo, Oslo, Tokyo, on fait le bunga, bunga.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back to BungaCast, the global politics podcast at the end of history. My name is Alex Hochuli. I'm in São Paulo, Brazil, and I'm joined by contributing editors to this podcast, Lee Jones in London. Hello, Lee.
Hi, Alex.
By Alex Gourevitch in Massachusetts. Hello, Alex.
Hello from Cambridge.
Yes. And very happy to be joined once again, a guest on this podcast, Corey Robin, who's a political theorist, a professor of political science at Brooklyn College and at the City University of New York. You'll probably have encountered him perhaps on this podcast or perhaps us talking about his work on this podcast in positive terms, I can assure Corey, on his works on the politics of fear as well as on the nature of conservatism. Welcome back, Corey.
Thanks for having me back. It's nice to be here.
Yeah, great to have you back on to talk Trump. So the last time that Corey was on this podcast was an episode 129, in case you wish to chase that up, from mid-2020. It was an episode entitled "The Right is Weak." And for a long time, Corey's argued that Trump is weaker than people give him credit for. And this was a subject that we had when we last spoke to Corey on this podcast. But for the kind of past couple of months, things have looked a bit differently. There were some setbacks for Trump, especially in the courts. But overall, the picture that emerged was that Trump was engaged in this relentless barrage of action across a wide range of issues, from education to immigration to civil service, and then a massive budget bill in the offing. And then, of course, there were the tariffs. But then at the same time, there was also the dramatic reversal on the tariffs. This is something that we discussed, Lee and I, in a recent episode that came out last week. And a huge amount has happened already since then. So we're going to touch on that and much else as well. In this episode, we want to discuss Trump and MAGA, especially from a domestic perspective. So what's Trump's modus operandi? What does he want? And how likely is he to actually achieve that? How strong is Trump? Also, what kind of opposition and resistance to Trump is there? And where is this coming from? Whether it's from the Republicans, from the courts, or indeed from the Democrats. And finally, I think we want to talk about the American oligarchy. So Elon Musk recently posted, I think this was last week, on X, a compilation video of Bernie Sanders warning about the coming of an American oligarchy, and doing so in almost identical terms over and over, multiple times, from 1983 until today. And Musk's post was accompanied by a laugh emoji, as if to say, haha, Bernie's the boy who cried wolf. Except in this case, it was a little bit like the wolf himself was doing the posting. So it's pretty ambiguous sort of statement from Musk. And indeed, is he laughing? Yeah, haha, this is an oligarchy and I'm the oligarch in chief. I don't know. There's lots to be read into this post, but we're not going to restrict ourselves just to examine a social media post. So anyway, we want to discuss the Trump-Musk alliance, what divisions there might be between Silicon Valley tech libertarianism on the one hand and MAGA nationalism on the other. So I'll pass on to Lee Jones.
Corey, can you help us cut through the noise? The Trump TV has been broadcasting 24/7 for some time now, but what do you see as being the most important and significant things that Trump has done, particularly domestically, since coming back to power?
Yeah, I think I think there are three things that I would focus on. The first thing is the mass firing of government workers. This is a tool that affects, potentially up to 2 million workers. He's had a tremendous amount of success in doing so. And it's also a tool that resonates with American history. Some of the most dramatic and most lethal moments of domestic political repression involved not putting people in jail, not violence or anything like that, but this form of economic sanctions in terms of firing. So it's they've been done quickly, they've been done dramatically, they've often been done with little to no process. and they've had a real effect not only on those government workers that are affected, but I think it sent, if there was probably any one thing that set the rest of society on the back foot, I think it was those things, because it suggested that Trump and Musk had found some kind of a lever of power that they previously just did not seem to have. And it was, and so I think it really had an effect. I would say that's the first thing. I think the second thing is the use of economic sanctions against both state and local governments and private institutions, including universities, most dramatically. Again, it's not simply that state and local governments or universities are very frightened of having, major forms of funding withdrawn, although that obviously plays a huge role. I think, again, in using this lever of power, it seemed like they, Trump and, well, this is really more Trump and the administration, they found something over which the rest of society has very little control. Now, the truth is, the rest of society does have a tremendous amount of control over this, but Trump is wielding that power as if Congress doesn't matter, as if the courts don't matter, as if these other institutions, as if the social consequences don't matter of all of this. So I think it's not just the power that he's used there, but the larger fear that it arouses, that these are political actors who act without fear of consequence. And that is a difficult thing to know how to fight back against. So I think that's the second big thing that I would mention. And then the last, I think, is just the, for lack of a better word, the sort of immigration terror politics. Initially, it seemed like Trump was going through the same playbook he had gone through the last time, with a lot of spectacular kinds of things that were masking a kind of fairly limited repertoire of tactics and effects. And, I think we really have to mention that under Biden and under Obama previously, the levels of deportations were spectacularly high. So I think initially going into this second term, it seemed like this was going to be maybe more of the same. But something has taken a turn here with the abduction just on the streets, and then the just indefinite holding of people and deportation to, not just to other countries, but to terror jails in other countries. What is material power there versus spectacle is hard to parse out. But, there's just no doubt that this has sent a very chilling message, not just to students, and frankly, not even to undocumented immigrants, but to all immigrants, and now even all dissidents in society, because Trump has used the immigration machinery, the bureaucratic apparatus, that terror apparatus, to also punish political speech. This isn't just a question of the undocumented or people we don't like because they come from the wrong part of the world. This is people who are saying the wrong things. And that marriage of this bureaucratic apparatus with the tremendous consequences for political speech and political association, I think has raised a specter that is, a very real concern. So I think all three of these things, you could look at, any one of these things, frankly, if he had done, would have raised any one of a number of specters from the American past, whether it was the first Red Scare, the second Red Scare, or the Gilded Age, or 1924 with the immigration restrictions, whatever it may be. But it's the coming together of it all, and the seeming ability to wield it all without any opposition, or if there's a monkey wrench thrown, and it ultimately seems not to matter very much. I think that's the way I would characterize the general situation, and why I think a number of us who were very skeptical the first time around have pulled, our skepticism has been a little shaken.
Hmm. Could I tag on a question, particularly with regard to immigration? Because what do you read as the underlying motive behind that? I mean, is it the kind of spectacle of cruelty? Is it, as you suggest, the attempt to kind of chill any sort of dissidence with regard to speech? Is it to demonstrate the capacity of the state to restrict the labor market and to restrict competition in the labor market for the kind of MAGA base? I mean, what do you think is predominant in that?
I have to be honest. I've been trying to think and talk and write about Trump for 8 years now, and I've somewhat reached the point that trying to figure out what's the actual intention or motive behind this is this is not about you, Alex, but it's almost a fool's errand. It's like, you know, any one of those things seem plausible, and it's hard to parse. But let's just so I try to focus as much as possible on consequences and effects, because I feel like that's actually something one can identify in the political world, whereas motives and intentions, I think, are tricky. Not, I mean, in general, it's tricky, but particularly with Trump, who's always reversing himself and doesn't have a steady course, I think it's really tough to figure it out.
Hmm.
Um, but I will say, just two things that you've spoken to. I mean, I really want to stress that I think the fusion of just the sort of general immigration restrictionism with the attacks on free speech, I think that's the major object of concern, and the kind of uh, um, it's almost like they just sort of stumbled on this. I mean, this has been done in the American past before, so I would not suggest that this is new by any stretch. But the particular way it has come together, particularly around questions of Palestine and so forth, I think this was, I don't think this was something that Project 2024 had sort of scripted out in advance. This was a discovery that they've had. And once they make that discovery, the reverberations and the consequences just go much, much, much farther. So then they start thinking, we'll do this, as I said, to documented immigrants. Why should you be, we didn't invite you here to speak about this kind of stuff. And then it's just the next step to say, this is how we're going to deal with citizens too, who do things we don't like. It's this kind of eliminationism. I don't mean it in the Nazi sense, but just getting rid of ism, let's say, to the problems of politics. So I think that's one really important part of this. In terms of the labor market, that you raised, this got almost no attention. But last Thursday, Trump made a speech saying that restaurants and farms, they really need these workers, and we've got to figure out for a system of getting all those people we've kicked out who are good people back in the country on, essentially guest worker passes,
Mm.
kind of, the German system basically that you saw, in the in the last however decades, starting in the 60s, that we want to have a kind of permanent guest worker system. Now, again, it's Trump, so who knows how that'll go down. Stephen Miller seems to have a much more, and here I would use the word eliminationist mentality when it comes to immigrants. Like, he really doesn't want them. But Trump is a cipher for different voices in his coalition, and I thought this was a revealing comment, and I think it's something that's really worth tracking. Just say one more thing about that. They've had this sort of MO in this administration. Like, we try something, it might succeed, it might fail, but we sort of look at, they're like kind of Dewey experimentalists. Let's see what works. And oh, wow, it turns out we do need those farm workers. Well, we got to figure out a way to get them back. And, this is what they've done in the federal government. Oh, yeah, we do kind of need those national park rangers. We'll hire them back on a contingent seasonal basis rather than give them permanent contracts. So it seems like I don't want to predict, but it seems like something like that could be in the offing when it comes to immigration.
Maybe precarity is the point and keeping people on edge. I wanted to just pick up on your points about freedom of speech, because there was a rather controversial thesis advanced on this podcast in relation to J.D. Vance's Munich conference speech, where he's came to Germany and wagged his finger at the authoritarian liberalism in the EU, and everybody melted down. And some people suggested it's a good thing that he's talking about free speech because it creates a standard by which the Trump administration could be judged. And of course, Trump, before he was re-elected, was promising to massively expand federal protections of free speech. And Robert F. Kennedy said that alone earned Trump a place on Mount Rushmore. So the question I have, I guess, is it true that all the talk about freedom of speech is providing a resource for people to criticize Trump, to mobilize people around? Or is it just, well, nobody really believed him in the first place? The right never really cares about freedom of speech.
Yeah, I tend to be much more of the latter for two reasons. I think with Trump and the right today, I mean, I think that, again, one of the reasons why they are proving to be, it wasn't difficult to fight them in the first term, but it wasn't a discursive fight that was fought. It was really like, they were just stopped on a whole bunch of votes, and Trump hadn't figured out these levers of power, and they were just stymied. But my experience has always been whenever you try to hold the MAGA right or the Trump right or Trump to any kind of rhetorical standard, it changes every hour on the hour. And this is why I always felt like that line, believe the autocrat, which, many people said, like, when he tells you what he's going to do, believe him. I thought that was nonsense because he says 1,000 things that he's going to do, and how to figure out which one of them matters. It's like Quicksilver. So I don't think that matters. And I think, and so here brings me to the second point. I think the left has to decide what matters to the left. And freedom of speech, and Alex Gourevitch has been, on this for a very long time, often a kind of a lone voice on the American left. But freedom of speech is a value for the left, and it has to be fought on its own terms. And to think that we're going to pursue that, as a way of gaining ground in the Trumpist regime today, I think is foolish. We have to pursue that because we need it, and we have done ourselves in over that issue. We haven't really talked about what happened last year. I know you guys have on this podcast, but with Israel and Gaza, there's no doubt that one of the reasons why the left caught itself so flat-footed in that debate, and was vulnerable, particularly in universities, was because words like safety and harm and trauma and all the rest of it, they are talismans, that everybody on the left feels like they need to bow down to. And we were not prepared to deal with it when those were wielded by defenders of the state of Israel on behalf of, let's face it, a group that has been historically marginalized and persecuted. So, that's the left needs to fight for freedom of speech for itself and for the good of society as a whole, not as trying to get a leg up on the right.
Absolutely. We should turn to tariffs, I think. Alex.
Yeah, I had really two questions on tariffs. One's about tariffs themselves. You just published a piece in the New Left Review on tariffs. You had a great line in there which speaks to the conversation we just had, which is, with Trump, anything is possible, so everything is plausible, which I really liked because it's a good line, but it also speaks to the problem of figuring out how we're supposed to think about the tariffs. Did he get what he wanted? How do we know if he got what he wanted? And you avoided that question because it seemed too hard to figure out. I wonder if, on reflection, you've had any further thoughts given the week's events. Is this just another case where they're kind of playing a pragmatic game? See what works, figure out who responds, or is there some aim that they're grasping their way to that explains the way they're responding to different complaints and so on?
And actually, should this be, anything is possible, so everything is plausible? Should this be the Trump 2 phrase, which is analogous to the Trump 1, take him seriously but not literally?
Right. These are hard questions, and I'm not being coy when I say, honestly, when it comes to figuring out what he's actually doing on the tariffs, I would defer more to you guys. And I say that because, I spent a good part of last week trying to figure out what he was up to. And Alex Gourevitch and I were on the phone talking about this quite a bit. And honestly, I did feel like, there were probably somewhere like 10 different theories of what he was doing. And they really did all, except for the part of the cruelty is the point, which I've never liked that theory at all. But the rest of them I felt like really were plausible and had some kind of purchase on reality, but I wouldn't know how to figure out which. And then you get the outcome of the situation. And there's always a tendency, I think, particularly, among more Marxist-oriented theorists, to try to read the outcome back into the design or the intention or the purpose of the whole thing. And I think that's a mistake, because we could have, just imagined a completely different outcome, and we would say, "Aha, that was the point." And I guess it's a kind of just a general check on my an epistemological humiliation, no, humility, excuse me, when it comes to this kind of stuff that I really genuinely don't know. But what I will say to Alex's point about trying to suss out where the weaknesses are and so forth. That did happen in this past week. Clearly the bond market is a weakness. We knew that. That's James Carville's famous line from 1993. He said, it used to be when I would think about being reborn, I'd want to come back as a great basketball player or the Pope or something. But now I realize if I were going to be reborn, I'd want to come back as the bond market. That's the real source of power in modern society. And, lo and behold, that's true. So I think that's one thing. But the other thing that I found far more interesting, which got very little attention, and I did speak about this, and I'm going to plug my own article here in the New Left Review, is that a faction of the judicial right, stemming from this guy, Leonard Leo, who ran the Federalist Society for many years. Leonard Leo, for those of you, the listeners who don't know, was really, is probably, is definitively responsible for appointing 5 out of the 9 justices on the Supreme Court, from the far right of Alito to the squishy far right of John Roberts. This guy, Leonard Leo, is the brainchild behind all of those appointments. And he was also the brainchild behind Trump's focus on judges in the first term. Remember, that was the big thing. Trump was appointing judge upon judge. And they're all Federalist Society judges. Why does this matter? Well, because the day after Liberation Day, a little stationery company in Florida that was owned by women filed a lawsuit against Trump's tariffs, the Trump-China tariffs, I should say, not the tariffs as a whole. And the important thing about the China tariffs was, remember, he had 2 executive orders back in March around the China tariffs. And then on Liberation Day, there were more tariffs. And then post-Liberation Day, when he announced the pause on the rest of the tariffs, he upped the China tariffs. So the China tariffs have proven to be a very permanent fixture of the tariff regime. This outfit in Florida filed a lawsuit against those tariffs, and it was backed by Leonard Leo's nonprofit, which has been a very influential nonprofit fighting the Biden administration for the last 4 years. So the reason I bring this up is that there is clearly a faction of the right that is not just Senate Republicans, and not just sort of, your establishment right, but a form of hard power, the judiciary, that are not happy about these tariffs and are not just looking to stop Trump, on some tariffs or whatever, but is really looking to claw back the power that the presidency has come to wield over the last century over tariffs, which were traditionally a power of Congress. So it's a very interesting showdown that could be developing. And Alex Gourevitch and I have also talked about this. There's a similarity there between the showdown that started to develop. I'm sorry, I don't want to lose you all here because there's a lot of showdowns happening, but very similar to the showdown that started to develop around the national security state in the 1970s and the power of the executive branch. Now it's over tariffs. And I think it does point to both a fissure in the heart in the right and also a kind of fissure over institutional power that a lot of the, oh gosh, rhetoric, both from the right and from the left around the rise of executive power might lead us to miss. So I think there's a lot going on in the tariff story. We're only just at the beginning of it, but that doesn't really speak to the question you were raising about really what is the motivation here behind the tariffs themselves.
Well, maybe we could look a different way, because we've now gone from starting with, well, Trump's actually been much more effective at exercising power in certain places than we expected, and now we've kind of drifted over to the constraints. Now, when he first took office, you and I and some people thought, well, what appears to be strength is in fact weakness, because it's being done all through executive orders. And the tariff is just another example. But the immigration stuff, the DEI stuff, the education stuff, all executive orders. And that was a sign of weakness because it indicated that there were a lot of things he couldn't do through Congress, and there's some things you can only do through Congress. And so he's sort of making the best out of a situation where he's got 2 or 3 vote majority in the House and only a couple votes in the Senate. So I wonder now, looking back on that initial analysis, how you would think about the use of executive orders. Is it, can we still tell this story, but from the standpoint of saying, well, what we discovered is that the only thing weaker than Trump were any of the bits that were likely to resist the use of executive orders, which seems a little bit like, kind of a rationalization. But I just wonder how you look back on that thought that had in February.
I really would love to hear what you guys think about this, but I tend to think it's still true.
Yeah.
That these are pretty brittle forms of power. I think, the belief that the institutional checks mattered very much, that's proven to be false, but I don't think either of us ever really were thinking about this as institutional checks.
Right.
And I think Trump really has broken ground in saying, like, he's sort of indifferent. And there it's interesting because, historically, and this is why I was always so skeptical of the fascism argument, but historically, all the worst things in America happen through institutions. They happen through laws. They happen through constitutional design.
Right.
And so I always thought, well, if one of the pillars of fascism is a kind of an assault on the constitutional order, well, that's never going to happen because it doesn't need to happen. It would be just pure surplus for it to happen. And while I tend to think that's true on the whole, the fact is that Trump has, with this impoundment issue and the sort of defiance of Congress over spending, if that continues, and they don't claw that power back, like I don't know where you go from there. And that really is a kind of it's a real anti-constitutional action. But what I do think is the real, if the Republican Party wanted to, they could claw back that power, and that's the real problem here. I mean, it seems like the Democrats are on the whole, they can be pretty united around this stuff. So this is why I'm somewhat optimistic. I mean, optimistic is too strong a word. Hopeful about the tariff issue, because you already have 7 or 8 Republicans in the Senate wanting to claw back that power from the executive branch. So that's plus the Democrats. And there's something like 12 in the House that want to do this. Not enough to override a veto, but it does show that, he's going, the more he does stuff that really cuts into the right, I think the more they're going to push back. I don't want to sit around and wait, that kind of thing. This is not a recipe, an argument for passivity by any stretch. But there's just, he hasn't rewritten all the rules of politics. And so I think we have to continue to look at that that kind of
Well,
stuff.
I wanted to ask
sorry, go
on
ahead.
that specifically, because to give, maybe you could help us, particularly those of us who don't follow American kind of internal politics so closely and the ins and outs of the relationship between branches of government and so on. You know, this question about Trump's strength, obviously it's hard to discuss these things in some general absolute sense, but we can discuss it relative to recent past, like what is the standard of an American president relative to these other branches of government, or just in purely relative terms within this term of this president versus Congress, this president versus the party in opposition. You know, maybe if the Democrats are weak, maybe Trump is also weak, but he's stronger than the Democrats, therefore he appears strong. Anyway, there's different ways to kind of slice this cake, and maybe you could give us a sense of what your read is on it, for those of us who don't follow so closely.
So to set that question up, I mean, I think I want to go back to the first Trump term, and because it helps us figure out what is strength and weakness. Because comparing the first Trump term to, say, George W. Bush, it seemed very clear to me the brittleness and the weakness of those instruments that Trump was relying on were very much on display, in that Trump was not able to get through a lot of things that he wanted through Congress. He was stymied repeatedly by the courts. And most important, he wasn't really able to change the national political conversation very much. In fact, if anything, he generated kind of counter move where suddenly you had, I don't remember what the numbers were, but 2/3 to 3/4 of the entire American population was absolutely pro-immigrant. Um, you know, uh, Black Lives Matter and questions of racial justice and reconciliation, became very high on the table. The Me Too movement. You had all these things happening that suggested that not only was Trump not getting what he wanted institutionally, but he wasn't able really to change the broader political culture and the broader political conversation. I, I don't know what the answer is right now to that question. So I'm more divided on this internally. And here again, I turn to you guys, but I'll just say, to me, on the one hand, some of that still seems to be true. Repression is not always the most powerful instrument for generating, hegemonic consensus. I could just as easily imagine the minute the dam breaks, a lot of this movement that has been, under lockdown can kind of push back. And then it will seem like, okay, he wasn't really able to transform society. That's one, part of me. The other part of me that knows about the history of McCarthyism, in particular the Second Red Scare, those were really successful projects that changed the terms of American political conversation, not just for an election cycle, but arguably for about 2 decades, and some of which we never really recovered from. They can be extremely, like, repression works. It's not used just for sadistic reasons. It's used to achieve a political end, and it can work. So I could imagine a society in which Trump will have been very successful. So I think where I'm sort of stuck on it, it's that old, it's too soon to tell. I'm open to really either side of this argument. Honestly, I could see it really going either way.
On this point, Corey, I wonder what you think. And then I also want to, we all wanted to ask you about the resistance or the lack thereof. But one of the other sort of too soon to tell questions for me, but which I've been thinking about a lot, is Trump's setting a lot of precedents for the exercise of presidential power in areas like spending, the management and control of education, and so on, that Republicans conventionally don't like. They tend, the president, not to want to have this kind of power. They tend to want it to be a states, the old line was states' rights, but a federalism question. And they've spent a lot of time developing legal theories to constrain the power of the executive to do things, or the federal state generally. And so one thing that I've been thinking about, and I'm curious to know how you see it, is never mind what Trump's aims are. The thinking seems to be incredibly short term.
Yeah.
Whatever the aims are, they're sort of short term. But Republicans, the party, tends to think more long term, and I'm struck with the partial exception, the very limited exception of this tariff power thing. They haven't really put up any resistance to it. And I guess what I'm trying to think about is why is that? Is it because they think he's this sort of generational political genius who knows what he's doing and is the future of the party, and so you kind of have to get in line? Is it that he's so taken over the party that they're just too afraid to dissent? Are there, they're usually pretty good at thinking about their own long-term interests.
Yeah.
So I wonder kind of how you read this particular aspect of Trump, which doesn't require us to really know much about his goals or his
Right.
fundamental motivations to think through the party's response.
Yeah, this has been a big puzzle for me, and I was just on another podcast last week where I feel like this is where I really come up against my own research and my own theory and thinking about the right. The right has always been a long-term project. It's always had a utopian element. It's always had a very forward-thinking element, and it's contrary to what everybody always says about the right. It's always been very interested in laying down a kind of coherent theory and intellectual foundations for that project. Of course, it's always done that in the crucible of its confrontation with the left. That's what's always pushed it to really think in these terms. Some cataclysmic defeat, some cataclysmic encounter with the left has forced the right to rethink everything it has done and to come up with new comprehensive theories that really junk the old arguments and create new ones that can last and institutions that can last. I find it hard to see that today, in all honesty, and not just. I mean, you brought up some of these things, but I would just add, the like the assaults on universities and and science and research. If you're thinking about competing with China for world hegemony, you have to know all those scientists and engineers that China is producing. Like, how are you seeing this? I don't, I mean, unless they want to just set up, high tech institutes, get rid of all universities and just, create these high tech institutes that will just be engineers. So I don't know. I don't get it. So I feel like I'm coming up against the limits of my own thinking about the right, because to me, this seems like a kind of, they this is the work of a party and a group of people who don't think they're going to be around very long, and that this is sort of end time thinking. And I hate going there because that's always the stereotype the left loves about the right. It's the evangelical right who thinks the rapture's coming and we're all going to disappear. But like, actions speak louder than words here, and I find it very, very hard to parse what the future is for these people. I really genuinely do. Like I said, this is the work of a group of people who don't have a theory of the future.
Lee, did you want to come in on this?
I did. I wanted to come in on this question of kind of strength and weakness and so on. I mean, one thing I've been playing with myself is there is obviously a difference between destructive power and creative power. To be simplistic about it, it's easy to tear something down and it's much harder to create something. And it seems to me that the trick that the Trump administration has found this time is they have found a way to destroy things. And essentially, they still have the weaknesses that Corey and you, Alex, were talking about in the first administration. They don't really know how to work through Congress to achieve their goals. And so they're resorting to extra constitutional means and creative legal arguments to try to do something completely new. So, for example, we can't rely on Congress to cut spending. So we must go around them and use Doge,
Right.
to create this destructive kind of cyber attack on the administrative state. And then it turns out that what institutionalists thought were institutional checks on executive power were actually just, well, they're heavily reliant on people activating those institutions, in fact, right? So institutions always, to some extent, reflect political dynamics. They don't just work magically on their own. And what's interesting in this case, as Corey was saying over the impoundment issue, is Congress hasn't done that. Congress hasn't acted to defend its prerogatives. And this is one of the kind of many things that was astonishing to me when I was doing fieldwork in Washington several weeks ago, when it was the week that the US had voted with Russia in the UN. Zelensky was in the White House. USAID employees were, before my very eyes, people I was interviewing earlier in the week were turning up and collecting their stuff in boxes. And people were literally shell-shocked. And they're kind of, why is Congress not even defending its own prerogatives? The power of the purse is one of the most important things that Congress has. The answer that was given to me, and I'd be interested in your views on this, is that it's the kind of the result of a long-term rot in the institutions of state and of the Republican Party itself. So first of all, the gerrymandering of congressional districts, to the extent that there are hardly any swing districts left anymore. So there's only about 20 odd districts that generally change hands, and consequently people are more concerned about primary challenges than they are about their party opponent. And the Trumpist takeover of the Republican Party and Musk's threat to fund the opponent of anybody that stood up to Trump was causing this kind of reign of terror in Congress, and Congress didn't do anything. And that seemed to be a good explanation up until the tariffs point. I don't know what you make of that explanation.
It's interesting. When you just were talking, I was going back and thinking about the Federalist Papers and checks on institutions. And, the principle of all those institutional divisions and checks and balances was not, it's always if men were angels, you wouldn't, really need a government in the first place. It was that these were extraordinarily ambitious people. These were people who wanted power. That was the presumption of that was supposed to make the whole thing go, is people want power. And what's really confusing, I think, right now is that even if you accept the idea that they're terrified of being primaried, and I will say that that's something we have to be careful about. That discourse was very popular during the McCarthy era. And it turned out to be oftentimes a total bullshit kind of line. And there were studies that were done showing that he had very little sway over any kind of Republican fortunes, and certainly Democratic. And likewise, I mean, I think when the dust settles, we might find that the story is far more complicated. I mean, after all, if you have gerrymandered districts, sometimes they're so gerrymandered that you can't really primary the person. They have that much power and that much kind of, and there are certain members of Congress that are like that. So I'm kind of stuck on this one, I guess, and I would be curious again to hear your guys' response, because if you assume these are people who want power, why do they want to stay in Congress at all if those powers are being stripped of you? Like, what's the off ramp or the on ramp? Where do they think they're going? Is it like to get a position in the Trump administration? And here again, I feel like there's no long term thinking there. That it's really day-to-day calculations that are driving it, because I don't see, if you're an up and coming Republican, knowing that you have like a minimum 10 to 15 years in Congress before you're going to get further than that. What do you think how do you make your mark for yourself if all you're supposed to be doing is rubber stamping whatever Trump happens to want on any given day, which of course changes from day to day? So I find parsing out the micro political calculations to be very, very difficult. And I'm not that persuaded by the fear argument, because you could imagine, what is being threatened, my political future. You could imagine that going a very different route, which is, I have no political future so long as this, polity is as it is. And yeah, so I don't know. I don't know how to make sense of it all. The role of ambition, the role of fear, and the kind of power dynamics that are really at play in here.
I wonder, Corey, how maybe it makes sense at this moment to then switch over to the other group that seems to be engaged in no clear long-term thinking, which is the Democrats.
That's easier.
And the incredible weakness of the resistance. So it seemed one of the more significant facts this time around that it took months for even a relatively small scale, national protest against Trump to take shape. And this was after much more, sort of harmful and extreme political activity from the Trump administration than the first time around. And the way I read it was that it was a mixture, and maybe it's two sides of the same thing, sort of elite demoralization by the defeat among the kind of leadership in the major institutions in which the wider kind of opinions and views of the Democratic Party are forged. And the fact that this time around Trump won the popular vote. And by winning the popular vote, he's been acting with the Democratic authority that he didn't have really the first time around. And the demoralization among the Democrats was the vote looked like a repudiation of them. That might even speak to some of the kind of overestimated or unearned or partially earned optimism among current Republicans. When you say there's no long-term thinking, it might be that they think, well, no, we've been voted in, we won against expectations and so on. They all Republicans kind of feel like Rambo or something. The underdog's been won and we represent the people. So, but that was my read about sort of how weak and disorganized the Democrats are. Since I don't know that I have more to explain how weak and disorganized it is. And I wonder what sort of thoughts you've had about, I guess, not just their weakness, but also what seems to be a total lack of strategic thinking on their side. I mean, I have not seen very serious efforts to come to terms with the defeat and figure out how to reorganize the party. Their strategy seems to be the standard non-strategy, which is hide behind the curtains, let the Republicans take responsibility for everything until what they're doing becomes unpopular, and then step back out in a game of kind of peekaboo.
Yeah.
To avoid any of that serious sort of political self-reflection and the difficult task of reorganizing the party. But I wonder how you see it.
I think it's a couple of things, but I think it's also, this is a really good, hard question. And so I think, first of all, and this goes against something that I had been thinking, but I think Democrats and liberals and progressives are still very vulnerable to the sense that when the right speaks on issues of American identity, on crime, on social issues, that somehow or another they're speaking the truth of America. And I really thought we had gotten past that, frankly, in the first Trump administration. I misread the tea leaves on this one, but I feel like so much of what the right Trump did in this last campaign, um, on the crime issue in particular, but also on the anti-trans issue and the anti-DEI. This is like very old stuff when you think about it. Like there's no the specific iterations and the targets change, but this is stuff that goes easily back to the Nixon administration and Nixon level politics. It's nothing new. And what was shocking to me was how vulnerable Democrats were to all of this. And we can debate why that is, and what that's all about. But I think what that tells you is that you still have a Democratic Party that's essentially fighting and defensive the battles and defensive around the battles of the 1960s and the 1970s, and has still not found a different playbook to launch a different trajectory of American politics. And that all it took was a slight increase in the homicide rate and during the COVID pandemic, and slight increase in immigration, and like suddenly everybody falls apart, and just doesn't. Sometimes they reveal themselves in those moments, the stumbling and the inability. There are two signs of weakness. One is the stumbling inability to fend off the argument. That's Biden. The other is the very rigid moralistic self-righteousness that you see on parts of the left around that issue, which is like, see no evil, hear no evil, because it's too afraid to actually take up the issue and really deal with it head on and say, no, there is some rising crime, but we actually have a way of dealing with it. And your solution of putting people in prison and that never worked anyway. So I think that's a big. I'm sorry. Did somebody want to say something?
Well, I just wanted to. I'm sorry, I didn't want to cut you off. I took intake of breath because I was thinking. But now that we're here, I mean, With the Democrats, I mean, I take the point about the Democrats' game having been defending the gains of the 1960s and fighting along those very same lines until today. But I think observing from outside, it seems to me that on issues like, I mean, even crime, immigration, race, abortion, etc., that they were setting the agenda in some ways, or that they were dominant over the past period. Now, I mean, obviously, critics, both on this podcast and elsewhere, that things that we've done, we've been saying that the Democrats have nothing to offer other than condescension, shutting people up, elite kind of technocratic methods of instituting the rule, etc., and not really, not even pursuing legislation in Congress. And so that showed their ultimate weakness. So there's obviously a tendency to, or there'd be an easy answer from our perspective to look at what's going on and go, well, of course, we've been saying that, the emperor has no clothes all along. So now that everyone's seeing them naked, well, duh, of course they have no answer.
Yeah.
But maybe there's something deeper going on there, particularly if you are saying, Corey, that actually the issue ownership that the Republicans have over something like crime has been now reasserted, and that the Democrats are very cowed by that. And maybe there's another interpretation, which is that the Democrats' contribution is not really the way that they own an issue is not to say we defend that they defend a particular position on something, but that they defend a kind of social constructionism with regard to an issue, that everything is as we say it is until it isn't, and that's about it.
Can I just offer a slightly different view, though, from what you two said, which is another thing that's happened over the last 20 years is the weakening of the Democrats' authority on economic issues and the growth of their authority on cultural issues. And part of their defensiveness, especially this time around, was having basically become associated with free trade, neoliberalism, sort of greater concern with access to elite institutions than with the nature of opportunity at the bottom, abandoning any of the large scale kind of projects that Democrats are associated with early time. Polls routinely showed more voter trust or equal trust than the Republicans. And that part of the reason that Democrats did lean on cultural issues was they thought that was where they were strong, and abortion was their kind of really when they felt they'd managed to, abortion's one of those issues where to call it a cultural issue is a little weird because it's like a fundamental right. The police are going to show up or not, it's a material issue. So it was more substantive than sort of speech codes at university or something like that. And then when they got voted out this time, they really seemed helpless because they were both losing on inflation and seemed to have lost their grit, their kind of the grip of cultural authority that they thought they had. So I feel like it's hard to talk about this if we don't think about also the background loss of authority of the Democratic Party over some decades with its kind of well-known neoliberal shift from Clinton to Obama, or really Carter to Obama, to reference the episode that we did with Tim Barker.
Right. No, I mean, I think that's, I see that as a kind of amplification of the general point, which is that I think I had thought that the Democrats were really on the ascendancy on all these, actually, frankly, also on the economic front as well. I mean, part of the, my read of the Trump first term was, if you looked, it was, there were all those Obama budgets that he passed. They weren't, they were not, with the exception of the tax cuts. It was, pretty much the liberals in the Democratic Party were setting the agenda. So I think, this is answering why is there no resistance. I think it turns out that, that this was, the whole thing was a bit of a shell game. And, there's been those, what's their names, Rosenfeld and Schlossman on the hollow parties. And the truth is that, the Democratic Party is not really a party. And, the emperor's no clothes that you mentioned earlier, Alex, really, applies on a whole bunch of fronts. So I think that's a big part of this. But the other thing, and I want to come back to something I said at the beginning, because I really feel like we have not, on the left, taken full stock of this, which is the way in which the right in Trump in this time around seems to have discovered material lovers of power that we thought not only did not exist, but that they certainly did not have access to. And I was really struck in a conversation I had last week with somebody who was saying, this thing about Musk, it's like he has the passcodes to the email accounts. He has the keys to the office, and he gets into the office. And it suddenly struck me like this used to be the left's repertoire of power. What were the sit down strikes? But like, you can't get in here. We're here. We material, and it wasn't symbolic. It wasn't protesting out in the streets. It was, we physically have control. And that's, the whole repertoire of the workers' movement really was the keystone of all of that. And even the kind of more cultural movements of the 60s, Stonewall or the feminist movement, they still managed to find, through either symbolic or material action, levers of power that could really bring institutions up short and like sort of seize up the institutions and freeze them from acting. And I feel like what's happened this time around is, on the one hand, the right seems to have these levers and keys and access that we never thought that they would have, where they can just act without, anybody stopping them. And on the other hand, what is the left? I mean, you mentioned protests in the streets, Alex, but my thought was like, oh God, another fucking protest to go to. Like, how many of them? No
Totally.
protest.
Only
When I
thing
was
worse
a
is
kid,
having to sign a petition.
right. And when I was a kid, a protest seemed like it had that radioactive power of transgression. I mean, this is like the mid 80s, where if you were from a suburb and, just kind of mainstream sort of society, like people didn't protest. So when they happened, it was like, whoa, it had a feeling of transgressiveness. And I don't think the left knows what that is anymore. Like, where are those? And I don't want to get too far afield here, but I was thinking like, those government workers, well, what if they had just refused to give their email passcodes? Like, I have this passcode, you don't have it, and you can't do anything if you don't have access to it. And instead it was like, well, no, I guess we'll leave and vacate the premises. I don't want to put, agency anywhere, because I don't know what would I do in those situations. But I guess my point is that all those vulnerabilities, those material levers, those abilities to like make the situation, the institution seize up and stop. We, the left, and this is everybody on the left. This isn't just the Democratic Party. This is everybody. Don't seem to know what that is anymore and how to get it. And I think you cannot underestimate what that feeling of powerlessness does to people. I mean, it makes me feel like, what is the point of speaking if this is never going to eventuate in some kind of real material form of action? Then you're really just talking into the wind. And that is a pretty bad situation to find yourself in.
I think this point you're making about the right being politically transgressive and not just culturally transgressive is an important one. But as you're speaking, it also makes me think about Alex's points about authority and the fact that Trump is emboldened by democratic authority. And it's very striking to me that all of the things that he was doing, particularly around executive orders, the kind of flurry of executive orders when he came to power, all of them designed to demonstrate to the people that had put him in office that he was going to do things differently and he was actually going to imprint their interests on the state. In other words, he was going to prove to them that by electing him, things were really going to change this time. Now, that's very open to question. Is this what people voted for? The non-MAGA elements of his voter base are turning against him. That's what opinion polls would suggest. But again, that's just something that the left just seems to lack, this idea that rules don't necessarily have to constrain you. We don't necessarily have to do everything by the book. If you think about Biden and Bidenomics, it's basically two senators that could rip anything progressive out of Bidenomics, and Trump's just not willing to allow that to happen. He's willing to push it to the point of a constitutional crisis to change things. The left isn't.
And it's interesting. This is coming up right now on their budget bill, because they have this crazy mishigas, the Republicans, about how they're going to count the last 10 years of tax cuts as essentially the normal baseline for estimating future tax cuts, which essentially means the cost of the future tax cuts is zero. I don't want to get into all the technicalities, but the Democrats' answer to this is, wait till the Senate parliamentarian rules on this. And the Republicans have already made it very clear, fuck the parliamentarian. Who created the parliamentarian anyway? Who gives a shit? And so that speaks, I think, Lee, to your point, is that there Trump, and this, I have to give credit to Trump. I mean, you mentioned, Lee, earlier about the rot that set in, and it's all becoming very clear now. But let's be honest. And I'm not somebody who likes to give credit. Like, I feel like the left loves to give credit to Trump for being some genius, which he's not. But he did see that rot, or at least he fumbled. He came up against it and realized he could just push right through it. And he was really the first national political figure to figure that out. And so we are left here. But I will say one other thing, though, on that question of authority and democratic authority. And I think this is another sort of rot that we've allowed. And I think Alex Gourevitch has also spoken to this in the past, which is the exaltation of presidential power. This is a longstanding problem. But, the president isn't the only democratically elected agent or institution in this system. Congress also is. Now, this is a problem that goes way, way back. Interestingly, Marx, was really aware of this problem in France in the 1848 Constitution, just the way it empowered the executive. And he wrote some very interesting things that go far beyond France about how the executive gets to embody the nation. He's the only embodiment of the nation, and the legislature, has kind of procedural legal authority, but it doesn't get that kind of exaltation. But that wasn't always the case in America. Reconstruction was a congressionally led effort. And I think if we're going to talk about reconstituting democracy and democratic authority, one thing that we have to get past is this fetish and fixation on the presidency. Because lo and behold, Trump has driven, that as far as, well, I was going to say as far as it goes, but probably can go much further. And nothing good can come from that. If you sort of seed the terrain that he's the only democratically elected politician. Governors are democratically elected. Why do they have to accede to his demands that have not been legislatively authorized, that in fact are in violation of the law? Why should they? And yet we seem to lack that discourse. So I think it's a broader kind of democratic rot that we're contending with here.
So on the democratic rot, one question that was on all of our minds is oligarchy. So another dimension of the rot of the institutions is the very kind of explicit and direct conquest of power, of political power, it would seem, by a super wealthy element that Musk represents. And I wonder, and I'd say in terms of redefining politics, actually, if I think about sort of how people are talking about this regime in a way that's different from last time, I would say last time there was really no discussion of oligarchy. That was something we wanted when I remember you and I having conversations about what should we call this if this isn't fascism? We said, well, it's oligarchy, but nobody sort of took that. Nobody really took that up. This time around, there seems to be a lot more receptivity to it because, yes, we know that both parties are parties of capital. They rule in the interests of capital. But there seems to be something much more explicit. Maybe Bernie's prediction has come true, as it were. The kind of enormous self-enrichment around Trump's family, the Trump and Melania coins, putting all these crypto bros directly in to the places that regulate them in the state, Trump gutting all the federal mechanisms for prosecuting corruption and financial crimes. I think he just suspended enforcement actions on like 100 different corporations. I mean, he's basically made it legal for corporations to bribe foreign governments. just ended the Foreign Corrupt, or I think technically suspended the Foreign Corrupt Services Act, which at least nominally said you're not allowed to do it.
Right.
So it's just so explicit. So I wonder sort of how this is another place where it seems maybe there is a kind of break, or it indicates something. Is Bernie right then? Are we living under an oligarchy, or is it something, is it just ordinary kleptocracy? Is this sort of the post-oligarchic phase, democratic phase?
Yeah.
In which
Or-
case, of course, there's nothing more grand and strategic about that. I mean, when the oligarchy reaches that phase, it isn't looking to the future. It is just
Yeah.
short-term self-enrichment with nothing
Right.
more. To everything else is just an instrument of that, which might explain something. So I'm curious, sort of what you think about the kind of think about oligarchy now. Sorry, Alex, I think you also wanted to.
Yeah.
No, go ahead, Corey.
Well, I mean, I definitely think it's a welcome development for all the reasons that you've spelled. It's a welcome general movement, particularly away from the fascism discourse, because again, no matter how people want to cut that argument and the specific scholarly disputes, the real reason that people, what fascism is meant to invoke is some kind of claim on the popular, and oligarchy, I think, takes us back somewhere else. Now, people will say, "Oh, oligarchy and fascism are not inconsistent." I think that's getting into a little bit of casuistry. The fact is, they point in very different directions in sort of political analysis, and so I do think it's welcome. And I would just add to the list of things that you were talking about that are sort of oligarchic. This got no attention, but there was a bill in Congress that the Democrats tried to pass just recently, last week, I think, to limit bank overdraft fees to like $5, or the charge, or to get rid of them. I can't remember. It was something. Every single Republican voted against it. And it's like, I think the window on the Republicans being a working class party have closed, and I don't think most people believe that anymore. But I say goodbye to all that. I'm glad we're moving beyond that. And I think oligarchy is definitely a welcome development. But it does raise the question that you've just raised, and to which I don't have a good answer, which is, it's not simply designing the rules to benefit themselves in the most transparent ways. And I think that is sort of moving on beyond the kind of general parties of capital sort of notion. I mean, this
Right.
is really, set up, the state. I mean, it really is like the spoils system. I mean, I was reading the other day Hofstadter's chapter on the spoilsmen in the American political tradition. It's like, whoa, I mean, these were people, like, they were thugs. They were thugs from beginning to end, and they had no hallowed view of the state at all. It was just an instrument for their personal enrichment. And that all sounds very familiar. However, I do sometimes, and this is where I start getting concerned, because I feel like oligarchy, there are instruments then to, fight against. But when you get to that level of kleptocracy that you were getting to, as like the sort of next phase of it all, the short-termism is really alarming. And here I feel like the short-termism of the right and their calculations mirror and match up with the short-termism of the left, that is always chasing its own tail, that can't settle on, one issue to even fight about. I mean, it was interesting, Alex, you asked at the beginning, what are talk us through what are the main three things, the main things that we're fighting against. And, I feel like that's what the left lacks, is a sort of any ability to kind of prioritize and to think through any of that kind of stuff, and pursues the same kind of, I don't know, cultural short-termism, you might say, of the right's economic short-termism. And it makes me really nervous, to be honest with you, because not only do I see no signs of leadership then, I don't see the possibility for leadership. And and then I don't know where we go from there.
I mean, that would be suggestive, I think, of a potential trap that the left could fall into. I mean, what you've described of a kind of degeneration of even oligarchy into patrimonialism and the kind of intermixing and breaking the boundaries between private interest and then the public interest. I mean, a very naked way, right? I think kind of abandoning any attempts or few attempts at disguising that and also how this play. And we're going to come on to actually the kind of ideological aspects of this and whether that has a certain appeal. But it's interesting to think about this in terms of post neoliberalism, because what Alex Gourevitch made reference to, the prohibition, the lifting of the prohibition of bribes on foreign governments. I mean, that sort of legislation, I don't know the backdrop to that specific piece of legislation, but that sort of thing is very much of a piece with neoliberal globalization and a concern with transparency. And transparency under neoliberal terms is really about stopping governments from rent seeking, from, for example, charging bribes for to companies for access to to their domestic markets. And this basically goes, repealing that legislation sounds to me like saying, yeah, actually, we can play that game if we want to. So if governments want to rent seek, then fine, allow companies to pay them bribes.
Yeah.
And it seems to, in that light, it means that the transition to post neoliberalism is through the door of kind of just outright corruption, right? It's not the implementation of a kind of new regime of accumulation or something like that. It's just a kind of a very crude breakdown. I don't mean to portray kind of neoliberalism as somehow anti-corrupt or non-corrupt, but it seems to be more like a lifting of prohibitions. And maybe Lee has something to add on this.
Just wanted to come in on this issue of oligarchy and its compatibility with neoliberalism, because the way that you characterize it would sound peculiar to a lot of people who study neoliberalism in the global south. So the bits of the world that I look at, oligarchy is absolutely the dominant mode of rule, although it may in some cases be shrouded in democratic forms, sometimes in authoritarian forms, sometimes in something a bit in between. And corruption, the brute use of force, etc., these things are fairly commonplace. And so perhaps what's happening in the United States is less a kind of transition away from neoliberalism, but a new phase of neoliberalism, a kind of reconfiguration of power relations, one where kind of open plunder of the state, fraud, corruption just become much more commonplace. But one of the things, a slight wrinkle, I don't think we should go too far in suggesting that basically the only faction represented in Trump and the only faction that's now ruling the country is just a bunch of oligarchs. I don't think any of us think that. I think most of us think the Trump administration does represent a particular coalition of social forces, some of them, of course, in a superordinate position, some of them in a subordinate position, but that the need to hold that coalition together presumably implies some kind of need to make some kinds of concessions to the subordinated forces.
This is what's so peculiar, though, about the tariff. And here I come back to that, because, if you look, I did a lot of looking at the Republican Party in the Gilded Age and their use of the tariff. And what was so interesting there was that the tariff really was a pure instrument for maintaining the political coalition against two other things that the Republican Party was very firmly in favor of, which is the gold standard and a deregulated national market. Those were not particularly popular principles. They were very difficult to achieve through Congress. That's why you relied on the presidency and the courts for them. But the tariff really was this thing that bought off certain parts of the population and really held. It was a political protection racket, essentially, the tariff for the Republicans, not a form of economic protectionism at all. And what's odd to me is that I agree with you. Like, there are different members of this coalition. They do need to hold it together. But this tariff is not holding this coalition together. It's really splitting it apart. And even if it could hold this coalition together, that really does require a kind of long-term thinking that cannot survive, two midterm, a midterm election cycle and a presidential election cycle. And so I find it odd, and I find it very odd, and because it's not going to hold that coalition together. And here's where the one part of the coalition that does think long term, which is the judicial right, they're the ones, they understand that laws and rules in a court need to be long term. Every day can't be a new day where you reinvent the rules, and so that's why they're pushing back very hard on him. over these tariffs. So I find it, it's a little bit confusing. But let me just come back to one thing about whether or not this is post neoliberal or post oligarchy and so forth. The one last thing that I've been really alarmed by in terms of how the left is mimicking the right is there have been a series of reports, and again, gets no attention, about the spread of gun culture among non right wing people, but among women of color, among community groups who have nothing to do with the right. And their basic argument, which has a certain kind of logic to it, is look, everything is breaking down. You can't count on the state to protect you. These people are crazy. What do you have? You have yourself, your kin, your family, your local group, your culture. This is a kind of tribalism, when that is, I find really alarming, and it does suggest to me a sort of, I don't want to get into the international dimensions of neoliberalism because I'm out of my league there, but at least domestically, that you're really moving beyond. It is this sort of sphere of patrimonialism and kind of regression to kind of pre-state formations that materially on the ground seem to be the direction that people are going in. And I don't know where we go from that.
Yeah, this has always seemed to me the contradiction of Republican gun cultures that never always undermine the real basis of the authority of the state that they want to defend, because they have to constantly promote the sense everybody's insecure unless everybody has a gun and it's really everyone out for themselves, constantly recreating the state of nature, no matter how powerful the state is. And then at the same time wanting a large national, multinational society and state that actually secures everybody within these institutions such that they don't have to be constantly establishing their own security so they can go off and do commerce. And I think Republicans have never, I just think Republicans have never really understood what they're doing when they defend gun culture in this way. And I agree with you about the implications for the spread of it in a certain way, because there is a left argument for it, but it's usually because there's people on the left who want to say, well, no, revolution. People have to be ready to rise up against their state.
Yeah,
And
but this isn't. This
that's not
isn't.
what this is. You're right.
Yeah,
No,
this is not preparing for revolution. This is
this is,
preparing for end days, and
yes,
that
it's
kind of
But,
stuff.
isn't that precisely why gun culture, emphasis on the second word there, is more important than the right to bear arms? I mean, it's a cultivation of a certain culture around kind of violence or preparedness, survivalism, etc.
Yeah, exactly.
But to turn things around, maybe sort of, I don't know, draw us to the close here. I did want to bring up one question, Corey, that came to mind with the tariff stuff, because you mentioned all that tariffs really exposed was the divisions and cracks within the Republican Party and the coalition instead of establishing them. Unlike, say, immigration. I actually think immigrations have been effective. The one thing that's been effective at holding together the Republicans and drawing and keeping some of those voters in that kind of lent their votes to Trump this time around. But tariff, no. And it drew a lot of public action from major senators, and people started to say more publicly, Republicans started to say more publicly, we're going to lose the midterms if we keep going this round. They're already worried about that. Now, if it's true that the Republicans are worried about losing the midterms, it means they think there are going to be midterms.
Yeah.
And they think there are going to be midterms because there are going to be midterms. No one's canceling elections. Which means not only are we still the formal democracy, it's the United States formal democracy it takes itself to be with all the limits and constraints and so on, but it's functioning sufficiently well that the party in power thinks it's going to lose. And so I wonder, I mean, I've had this dispute with people the last couple of months where I've said, yes, I agree that there is the illegal exercise of power, there's the unconstitutional exercise of power, Trump stretching things in the way some predecessors didn't. But this is not a dictatorship. We're not there. It's true. Anything can happen, sure. But this is still basically the formal democracy with a lot of undemocratic elements that it has been. And if Republicans think they're going to lose, doesn't that tell us that this is still basically the same kind of regime that we've had, and that the democracy might even be, the democratic elements of this regime might be healthier than we think? and that we're confusing the weakness of opposition and the unwillingness of certain institutions to kind of claim back their powers from Trump with the collapse of democracy itself.
Yeah. I mean, yes, and there's no doubt. I mean, honestly, of all the people and different arguments that have been made over the last 8 years about the nature of tyranny, this, that, and the other, I do think the group that has the strongest purchase on what's going on are the theorists of competitive authoritarianism. They have argued that you still will have elections, you still will have parties. It just becomes harder to win them and so forth. And I'm not saying that they're right, but I'm saying I think they come the closest of all of the different theorizations of anybody, because I think they get that mix of democracy and repressiveness, for lack of a better word. But I think you're absolutely right, and this has been true from the get-go that all of the Trump people said we have basically 2 years to do this, and then Congress is going to go back to the Democrats, and we won't. The only thing that makes me nervous about that is that this is the main thing, is that Trump, with these impoundment stuff, has stumbled upon mechanisms and instruments that nobody was talking about this really before, and those. Sure, you can then have formal democratic elections, but if the institutions are in no way, shape, or form, have any authority at all, because you could even imagine the Democrats saying, "No, you're not allowed to, have that spending power." And then what happens? They file a lawsuit, and we have to go through this whole fucking thing with the goddamn courts. And by the time it's all over, he's gutted whatever institution it is. So I'm less sanguine, I guess, about this is still a functioning democracy, because I do think he has, with the stuff with impoundment, and even if he does ultimately pay attention to the courts, his attitude to the courts is now what corporations' attitudes have been to the courts during labor struggles. Like, we understand, you're going to
Right.
file a grievance, and
Right.
it's going to go to the NLRB, and fine, in 10 years
Right.
after we've appealed it, we have to pay a fine. Big fucking
Right.
deal.
Right.
And you can't really have any kind of, like, we're talking a much more degraded kind of democracy at that point.
Yep.
That I think is different from what you and I probably previously would have thought in that first term.
Yep. Sounds right.
I just wanted to follow up on the point about his defiance of the courts. That does seem to be quite distinctive this time round, and it does seem to raise a fundamental question, right? So if Congress is passing laws, the executive is simply ignoring them, and the executive is having rulings made against them, and simply says, how many divisions has the Pope? J.D. Vance is invoking of old opposition to Supreme Courts. They can't really enforce it. It seems to raise a fundamental constitutional question, right? Which is, well, which side will law enforcement side with? The extent of the executive's power to direct law enforcement to say, stop investigating this and investigate that, is quite astonishing. This is what seems the question of what we call this, right? Is it degenerating into authoritarianism? Is it, as people have said for a long time, is it fascism? Seems to hinge on this fundamental question about whether the United States is still a society of laws. Does the rule of law still exist? Or does it come down to which side will the coercive apparatus of the state stand on? Like, what's the FBI going to do? What is the military going to do?
Right.
When we start asking those kinds of questions, that seems to be an extraordinarily dangerous situation to be in.
I agree, but I think I want to distinguish what I was just saying from that scenario. I think that scenario is the one that a lot of people have been focusing on, and understandably so, and debating. And I will not say what I would have in the past said, which is it won't come down to that. I would have said that in the past. I won't say that anymore, because I really genuinely no longer know and feel like it could go anywhere. But the scenario that I had in mind was something more like what I was talking about when I referred to corporations dealing with union litigation. So it's not so much a kind of like an ultimate showdown, at noon, and where you have this ultimate showdown, and it's like, which way is the military going to go? It's more, they will resist and say no and force you to keep appealing and appealing. And I think in the end, if the Supreme Court says it, I suspect the Trump administration will go with the Supreme Court says. I don't think they're ready to defy the courts. The problem is deeper than that, which is that in the meantime, you've been going through this process, and because they've discovered these impoundment powers and these, keys and access to institutions and executive agencies that they can just control, they can degrade those so far that even if you win in court, all the employees, everybody you've hired is gone. Like, they've gone into the private sector, they've left the country, so materially you've destroyed it. And I think that, to me, is the scenario that I anticipate. Why I think the language of a degraded democracy is really better. And again, they have a precedent for this. This is what employers did over the course of 50 years. Like, they didn't outright defy the law and force a showdown with the military. They just drag you through the law. The law, delay, and that's your friend if you're on the side of power. That's not your enemy. And I feel like that's the scenario that I'm anticipating that is, I think, worse than the one that Alex Gourevitch and I were anticipating in the first term, where we thought, ultimately the courts have all the power. The Supreme Court, I think, does. But an awful lot has to, look what's happening with some of these immigration detainees. It's like you go all the way to the Supreme Court up, and the court says to the lower judge, no, you can order the executive to facilitate, but not to effectuate the return of this person from El Salvador. Now we go through that whole thing. And meanwhile, this person is rotting in a jail in El Salvador and may not survive. And that's not just about that one person. It's about the message it sends to everybody else in their proximate communities to say, your immigration attorney is going to say, don't worry, we have the law on our side. Any person is going to say, what are you, fucking insane? The law's on our side. So I think it's the degradation of law, not so much the outright destruction of it.
Well, anything is possible, so everything is plausible. We never said the end of history would be pretty. I do think that the El Salvador deal, El Salvador prostituting itself as basically selling its prison services, is one of the most dystopian elements to emerge in the global scene recently. And the U.S. and the Trump administration's take-up of that offer is particularly dystopian. That would be nice to explore, and maybe we should do that at another time. We also had some issues which we wanted to discuss further in terms of the ideology of success that might motivate Mr. Trump or not, the divisions between nationalist and libertarian wings of the MAGA movement and who will be triumphant within that. All that we'll have to leave for another time, maybe sooner rather than later, if you'd be willing to come back on and do that with us, Corey. But for now, thank you very much.